It's great to be here tonight. Emily, thank you so much for organizing this, and thank you to the Washington County Historical Society for having me. A little bit about me. I grew up outside of Philadelphia, and I now live just outside of Boston with my husband. I Professionally, I've had an extremely varied career, to say the least. I started out, I was an African studies major in college, and then at various times I've worked as a newspaper reporter, as a corporate writer. I had a very short stint in sales. I did corporate communications. And then in 1998, I entered the world of information technology, which is what I've done for work ever since then. So my standard joke when people ask me what I do for a living is I say that I'm a liberal arts major who impersonates a corporate IT person during the day. So now I'd like to start the little slideshow. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so my Minnesota connection. I moved to Minneapolis in 1987 to pursue an MA in geography at the University of Minnesota, and I ended up living in Minnesota for 7 years. So what you see in front of you is a memento from my time studying geography. It's a 1909 map of the trains and I believe water lines in the Twin Cities. And this is actually, it's on the wall of my home to this day. And you can actually see still water at the upper right. So I guess at one point you could get there via train. At any rate, the geography MA didn't work out. I loved history and maps, and I loved doing research, but I hated writing academic papers. But happily, while I was at the U, I discovered journalism at the Minnesota Daily, which is the University of Minnesota newspaper. And that led to reporting jobs in Chanhassen, Chaska, Faribault. I covered Rice County and I covered Northfield. And then I did internal communications at 3M in Woodbury. And so I made a lot of great friends while I was in Minnesota, and I've stayed in touch with a lot of them. While I was there, I always lived in Minneapolis. When I went to the U, I lived in the Cedar Riverside and Como area. And later I lived in Lowry Hill, just off Franklin. For those of you who kind of track your travels by the location of ice cream, I was very near the Sebastian Joe's on Franklin Avenue. So at any rate, so let's move on to my book. We'll be talking about tonight, Buried Secrets, Looking for Frank and Ida. So that is my grandparents, Frank and Ida, on the cover. I think these pictures were taken, approximately 1920. Let's go to the next. So here is Frank and Ida in the mid 1930s. So how the book got started was my dad, he grew up in Akron, Ohio in the 1930s and 1940s. and he was one of 4 boys. His parents were always very secretive about their past. They simply refused to discuss it. They always said they were from Brooklyn, New York, but if my dad ever asked about the family back in Brooklyn, their reply was, they're dead, they're gone, and they just would not speak further about it. So my dad and his brothers learned that you just don't ask about it. So this is my dad and his brothers in the 1930s. My dad is the second one from the left. And he always thought this extreme secrecy was strange. Like when he was a kid, like all of his friends, they had aunts and uncles, grandparents, cousins, whereas he didn't have a single relative. He didn't like have a single name. And he was always just the kind of kid who wondered about this kind of thing. Something always seemed off to him, even as a kid, but he didn't know what it was. So so here is my dad. Now he's all grown up, obviously, and I'm the little girl in the front, and there's my sister Karen. I'm about 3 in this picture. So as far back as I can remember, my dad was always wondering about the family back in Brooklyn. He was always like, and he was always just wondering about his parents too. Like, when were they born? Maybe 1899, maybe 1903. He just had no idea. So so when my sisters and I became old enough in the late 1970s, my dad started asking us to research his family history. So by this time, we had a little bit of information to go on. A young woman named Virginia, who married into the family, had always thought it was so strange that the Hanson boys didn't know anything about the family back in Brooklyn. And so she sat my grandparents down one day and just asked them for some information about their families. And they gave her like a bunch of names. And so based on this, she created these family trees. And you can see to the left, there's my grandfather, Frank Elmer Hanson. He was the oldest of 9 children. That's what he told Virginia. And then to the right, we have my grandmother, Ida Agnes Howe. She was an orphan. Her parents had been immigrants from Sheffield, England. And so there's the name of all of her aunts and uncles back in Sheffield. So, so we started researching this, and the problem was we could never validate a single fact or a single person in this supposed family tree. And we looked at just everything you can imagine. And other family members did too. My uncle and my aunt, my sisters and I. We looked in city directories, the census, school records, vital records. My dad and I actually called up this archive in Liverpool to see if they had some ship manifests. So we just could not verify a single fact of this supposed family tree. So fast forward a couple more decades. So this is me and my dad in 1999. So by this time, everyone in the family except me and my dad had just given up on the search. Like my uncle Al, who had been working really hard on the research, he said to my dad, "I don't think our parents ever existed." I mean, there was no evidence that, that their lives had ever taken place, back in New York. But then what happened in the year 2000 is actually 2 of my dad's brothers died suddenly. and he came into possession of a box with his parents' photo collection. Almost none of the photos had any names or dates, but at the bottom of this box of old photos, there was a small little picture of a grave with a blurry inscription that was, partially hidden. And this photo ultimately provided the clue that allowed me to break the case. And so ultimately I did discover the truth of my grandparents' past. And I guess for me, like, the most important thing was that I gave my dad answers that he had longed for his entire life. So this book has been a very long time in the making. My dad was the first one to say, you should write a book about this. And I thought, well, I can do that. I mean, I used to write for a living. I used to be a journalist, but I had no idea what I was getting into, and I had no idea how to write a book. So I took writing classes and I learned. There were certainly several years when life would intervene and I didn't work on it at all. But finally, I finished the final revisions during the pandemic. And so now the book is done and it's out there. So now I'd like to read a short excerpt. So I'm going to read the prologue and then part of chapter 1. So let me just turn the light on here so I can see a little better. I should note that, actually, let's just, so now I should note that this is a work of nonfiction. The book does have imagined scenes, but they're very clearly separated from the the very true and carefully researched portions of the book. So prologue. September 1955, imagining the past. There it is, go left. Frank was already turning the wheel of the green Studebaker before Ida finished her instructions. They continued slowly down the curving suburban lane. It was a bright September day, a gentle breeze whispering warm echoes of summer, as my grandparents, Frank and Ida Hanson, drove through a neighborhood just like thousands that had sprung up across the United States in the 1950s. Small, tidy ranch houses with compact lawns, new siding, and fresh paint jobs lined both sides of the road in neat configurations. In the backyards, jungle gyms, swings, and children's toys reigned over miniature green landscapes. Ida clutched a scrap of paper on which she had written an address in precise cursive. Behind rectangular spectacles, her eyes darted back and forth. Her hand fluttered from the camera on her lap to her hair, tucking an imaginary stray wisp back into her gray bun. The car's front windows were rolled all the way down, allowing the afternoon air to waft through the vehicle. Frank's gaze held steadily to the road ahead, with an occasional glance up at their tranquil surroundings. Although the modest fringe of white hair encircling his mostly bald head signaled the departure of youth, Frank's muscular arms, relaxed as they guided the steering wheel, remained the powerful tools of a working carpenter. Ida leaned out the window to study the number on each house they passed. That's it. Her abrupt voice again broke their silence. Number 117 A modest blue ranch house with a newly mowed lawn and a clump of orderly shrubs looked much like every other dwelling in the neighborhood. The shades were drawn and the driveway was empty. Next door, a blond boy circled his tricycle around and around in the driveway, a few feet from a stocky man washing a shiny blue Ford mainline sedan. "Daddy, Daddy!" The child's high-pitched happy shriek elicited a grin from the man, whose ruddy features were reflected on the young cyclist's round face. "Look at me, Daddy!" "Stop before we're in front of it," Ida said. "Close your window. I don't want anyone to see us." Whether the window was open or closed made little difference in their visibility, but after 3 decades of marriage, Frank knew better than to challenge Ida when her curt tones signaled agitation. He rolled up his window. She inhaled with a quick, sharp gasp. The man next door was looking straight at the Studebaker. Did he recognize them? Probably not. After a long moment, he turned back to his gleaming vehicle, obliterating soap suds from the fender with quick blasts of the hose. Frank pulled over to the curb, halfway between the neighbor's house and number 117. Across the street, a young woman in a yellow blouse, pedal pushers, and a headdress of pink curlers wielded an oversized pair of clippers as she pruned the bushes lining her front walk. Frank and Ida sat in the Studebaker, the windows rolled up, looking at the small blue house. Sweat trickled down their backs as the heat inside the car intensified. Ida picked up the camera and pointed it at number 117. The click of the shutter echoed within the quiet, motionless vehicle. Within Ida's mind, it felt like the slam of a hollow door. "Let's go and come back down the street from the other side." Frank pulled the Studebaker away from the curb, and slowly they wound down the road. After 100 yards, he made a U-turn and guided the car back up the lane until they were almost in front of number 117 again, this time on the other side of the street. He halted, leaving the motor running. The woman in curlers had progressed to the side of her house, where she continued to steadily snip offending branches. Straightening up, she stared at the car again, clippers dangling from her right hand. "You take it now," Ida said, handing Frank the camera. Through his closed window, Frank pointed the camera across the street at number 117 and snapped. "Oh no, she's watching us. We need to move. Drive down so she can't see us." Nodding, Frank pulled forward a few yards until the woman was out of sight behind the corner of her house. He stopped in front of a newly planted seedling with a spindly trunk and thin, delicate branches. Twisting around in her seat, Ida stared back at the blue ranch house for a long minute, her jaw clenched. One hand still clutched the now forgotten scrap of paper with the address. I wish she hadn't seen us." Ida's voice broke between shallow breaths. "It'll be okay, sweetie," Frank whispered, stroking her hair. "It's all right." He placed the camera in Ida's purse and wrapped his arms around her. Tears streamed down her face, and she began rocking back and forth, her shoulders heaving, the scrap of paper fluttering to the car floor. Outside the vehicle, Ida's moans dissipated in the swelling afternoon breeze. The seedling tree's slender limbs quivered as the wind gained force, their bobbing shadows writhing in an unearthly waltz on the sidewalk. Ida's cries gradually subsided. She sat up straight and very still. Finally, she began wiping her wet eyes and cheeks with Frank's handkerchief, while he gently caressed her shoulders. "Okay, let's go," Ida murmured finally in a dull, low tone. Inside her camera, the rays of light that had beamed through the open shutter during those fractions of a second had done their work, searing hazy images into the undeveloped film. The telltale prints, unseen for the next 50 years, mutely attested to Ida and Frank's path that September day. Chapter 1, Ghosts in a Box, August 2002. "Come on, Dad," I said. "Let me just look in the box. The pictures might have clues." "No." "Why not?" I asked. "I don't want to get it out. It's depressing." My father, Harley, couldn't face the box containing his parents' photo collection, even though its contents might help solve our baffling family mystery. For decades, a rotating cast of family members had tried and failed to trace the family trees of his Brooklyn-born parents, Frank Elmer Hanson and Ida Agnes Howe Hanson. Now, a previously unknown trove of photos had the potential to breathe new life into the family project, as my dad had dubbed our investigation into his parents' identities. If only I could get my hands on those pictures. How frustrating it was that my dad refused to let me look at them, especially since he was the one who, years earlier, had gotten me involved in the family project. Despite his belief in seeking truth and confronting facts, my father, a retired scientist and behavioral psychologist, shrank from this one particular box of evidence. Until he was 69, my dad was one of the 4 Hanson boys, brothers who had grown up during the 1930s and 1940s in a bungalow in North Hill, a working class neighborhood of Akron, Ohio. Then, in March of 2000, my dad's favorite older brother, Al, died abruptly of cardiac arrest. A month later, his twin brother, Harvey, was diagnosed with liver cancer. By June of 2000, Uncle Harvey was gone too, slowly inhaling one last gulp of air 30 minutes after I arrived at his bedside in a hospice in Dayton, Ohio. My father had paid his final visit a day earlier. A month after this double blow, a box containing Ida and Frank's photo collection arrived at the doorstep of the ranch house my dad shared with my stepmother, Carol, in an outer ring suburb north of Philadelphia. Uncle Al's widow, Aunt Betty, had cleaned house, shipping off Hanson memorabilia that had been consigned to the oblivion of storage ever since Frank, my grandpa, died in 1982. As soon as my dad mentioned the box, I began badgering him to let me see its contents. These photos were our last best chance for a break in the case of our seemingly unsolvable family mystery, genetic ancestry testing being, at the time, in its untried infancy. Yet no matter whether I cajoled my dad on the phone or appealed in person when I came down from Boston, we always ended up at the same impasse. Can you get out the box tonight? I'd say. "You don't have to look at the pictures. I'll go through them for you. I'll just look to see if there's anything that could help us in the research." "No, I don't want to," he invariably replied. "Maybe next time you come." His jaw, the strong angles of his youth now gently camouflaged by a layer of flesh, jutted forward. The subject was closed. It seemed unfathomable that my father could refuse me access to this newly unearthed box of photos. At his request, I had begun my labors in the Hanson and Howe genealogical wilderness during college 2 decades earlier. For years, he had even insisted on paying me by the hour. Now here, I'm just going to skip a little bit ahead in chapter 1 to the last 2 pages of the chapter. In August of 2002, I was again visiting my father and stepmother, Carol. As we drove home from dinner, I decided to ask for the pictures yet again. My father was relaxed after enjoying an extra rare steak along with a few drinks and good conversation. This was the best chance I was going to get. "Hey, Dad," I said, "let's get the pictures out tonight." No. From the rear seat of the dark car, I could see only the back of his head, but I could envision him pursing his lips as he stared straight ahead. "You said I could look at them next time I came." "You did, Harley," Carol chimed in. "You promised. You said you'd let her see them this visit." "I changed my mind," he said flatly. After a long silence, we exchanged only a handful of words the rest of the way home. When we got back to the house, he disappeared into his private study, dubbed the junk room, and closed the door. Something was up. Typically, my dad's first order of business after getting home was to change from his going out clothes into his comfortable at-home uniform of old slacks and a threadbare but clean short sleeve button-down shirt. A few minutes later, he returned, staring straight ahead, clasping a battered brown cardboard box the size of a large hat box. Avoiding eye contact, with a soft thump, he placed the box in front of me on the table of the keeping room, as he and Carol called the all-purpose living area just off their kitchen. "Don't look at them now. I don't want to talk about it." Startled, I stared at this long-sought prize, encased in its shell of brown cardboard and packing tape. I longed to tear it open and dive in, but I would have to hold out a little longer. "Okay, that's fine," I said, composing my face into the most neutral expression I could muster. Wordlessly, I bore my treasure down the beige carpeted hallway to Carol's small study, which doubled as the guest room. Carol's brown eyes were sparkling when I returned to the keeping room. "I think the answer is going to be in those pictures," she said. My father and I spent the rest of the evening chatting in the basement den as we half-watched TV, idly flicking between his favorite stations, the History Channel and public TV. On the floor by the couch were the slippers my father always wore indoors. Until my parents split up when I was 14, a similar pair of worn brown leather slippers by the back door promised his return home from long hours at the Merck labs. When I was a toddler, the child of another scientist in his lab had contracted amoebic dysentery from monkey excrement the fellow had unwittingly tracked home on his shoes. Horrified, thereafter my dad had always donned slippers immediately upon entering the house, a practice he had continued after retirement. He never replaced a pair until the leather was cracking and soles splitting. Also typical of my dad was that he didn't tell me and my sisters why he always wore slippers inside. As was his way, he quietly protected us against dangers large and small. At midnight, leaving my father downstairs still watching TV, I padded down the dimly lit hallway to Carol's study, where the photos awaited me. Finally, after 2 long years, I was about to enter the hidden world housed in that simple cardboard box. So that is the end of chapter 1. I believe at this point I was, be happy to entertain questions or be interested in your comments and reactions. Does anybody have any questions?
How does it end? I want the punchline.
How does it end? Well, I did solve the mystery. I am not going to tell you what I found, but I will say I did learn the truth of my grandparents' past. And so that is what I will say.
We have a question. Can you hear me, Anne?
I can hear, yes.
Excellent. We have a question from in the audience.
Well, I had the same question. I was under the impression hear the whole story tonight, so I'm a little disappointed.
Oh. Can you give us a good hint, Anne, about it? Give us a good hint.
Let's see. Well, my grandparents did not kill anyone. Well, they did not kill anyone. I would say that the truth of their, it's funny, my dad and I, my grandfather worked in construction all of his working life. And, we always, and he was also a very strong union man. He always belonged to a union. He actually ran a program for apprentices. And so we always thought, maybe, he was in trouble with the mob in New York or with union busters. So we always, my dad and I always conjectured that was what it was, and we were mistaken. So yeah, I don't think there's quite enough to talk about the whole book tonight, but I hope I've piqued your interest enough that you'll want to read it.
I have a question.
Yes.
This is Tracy, your cousin.
Hi, Tracy. Yes. Hi, Tracy.
How are you?
So nice to see you.
I just wondered why you think, like, for so long, your dad did not want to give you the box, like, did not want to pursue it to begin.
Yeah. Well, I think it was pain. My dad, like many men of his generation, my dad was born in 1931. He was not one to talk about his feelings or about his emotions, but I think losing his brothers, your uncles as well, losing them as he did in the year 2000, it really just shook him and made him incredibly sad. And I think it was just the idea of having to look at that box. I think it just brought a great deal of pain that he didn't want to face. It's ironic because, said ever since I was a little kid, he was always talking about like wanting to understand his parents' past. Yeah, and as soon as I was old enough, and as soon as my sisters were old enough, he was always asking us to research it. But no, Tracy, right. I just think it was, the pain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you at least tell us where you got started? What was the kickoff point for your search?
Yeah, well, there was at the bottom of this box of photos, there was, there was all kinds of photos from every era in this box, but at the bottom of the box, were there was actually a number of photos of graveyards. My grandparents went on a lot of road trips in the 1950s. They visited my dad and I was not yet born, but my sisters in North Carolina. They went to see my cousins in Atlanta. And then they spent a great deal of time roaming around graveyards and taking pictures of graves. And so it was that the problem was all of these gravestones that I don't know if it was on purpose or if they discarded some of them, but you really couldn't see any of the inscriptions except there was this one sort of photo, kind of crooked photo of this grave. It actually looked like it was a mistake that they hadn't bothered to discard. Way back when we used to, have film and our cameras and we take pictures, and sometimes there'd be a bad one you hadn't meant to take, and you just don't bother throwing it away. For the longest time, I thought that that's what it was. But at any rate, this photo was the opened up the first crack that allowed me to sort of break open the case.
We have a question from the chat for you, Anne. It's from Jean Brown, and she would like to know what the connection is to Stillwater and me, Emily. I'd like to widen it up to just Minnesota.
Yeah.
What is your connection to Minnesota?
Oh, yeah. I guess you might have joined after the start of our time here. I lived in Minnesota for 7 years. I studied geography at the University of Minnesota, and then I ended up not finishing the geography degree, but I became a reporter, and I actually worked in communities all around the Twin Cities, as well as I was a reporter down in Rice County in Faribault, and I covered the city of Northfield. And I guess like all good geographers, like I loved doing road trips. And so, with a friend, we drove all over the state, and, I got to know the state quite well. So, so my connection is I spent 7 years there, and I have very happy memories of that time. And I still have friends that I made in Minnesota. And so that's my connection. So there's a question in the chat. So the question is, but your grandparents weren't from Minnesota? No, my grandparents always said they were from Brooklyn, New York. But then they ended up as young adults moving to Akron, Ohio. So that's where they lived for the rest of their lives, and where my dad and his brothers grew up. But yes, with a name like Hanson, there's lots of Hansons in the Twin Cities and in Minnesota. So yeah, the connection is that I lived in Minnesota, have fond memories of my time there, and still have friends there.
Next
Can you
from
tell us
the chat?
what kind of, Anne, can
I'm
you
sorry.
tell?
I'm sorry. I sort of the second part of the question was cut off. Could you repeat that, please?
This is Mary Ann. Can you tell us what sources you used or what tools you used?
Oh yeah. I would.
And why you used those, please?
Well, let's see. Actually, in my research, both before I got the box of photos with that important gravestone clue, and afterwards, I used every source that you can imagine. The obvious one is census records, city directories, school records, vital records, which is birth, death, marriage records, property records, ship passenger lists, church records, you name it, I use those sources. And and newspapers were also an incredibly important source for me.
Thank you.
Question from in the room, and then I see there's another one on chat as well. So here's the one from in the room.
Hi there. So you mentioned that when your dad was young growing up, that he found it odd that other children had extended families and he had none.
Mhm.
Did solving this mystery lead to you finding extended family members?
Yes. Short answer, yes. Yeah, it's funny. My dad grew, yeah, in North Hill, Akron. There was a very large Italian community there, and there was actually, Akron was really a melting pot because it was a bustling, booming manufacturing city for rubber in the teens and 20s. So people came from all over the world there. And so, yeah, all of his friends, they all had these relatives, and he did not. But yes, I did find extended family, and I and my dad and mom Carol, like we met them together. And I have to say, this was one of the, I mean, there was a lot of rewarding things about this experience, but sharing the experience with my dad of him meeting his extended family was very rewarding for me and for him too.
I have a question that kind of piggybacks onto that. I was just wondering personally how it felt to walk into the home with these relatives and that you didn't know you had. I mean, what was your overall feeling?
Well, well, let's say, I mean, I don't want to get too much into the details. I mean, I think for me, it was, I had always been very focused on solving the mystery. That was, that was my, I don't want to say single-minded focus, but it's been a couple decades on and off. And of course, there were long periods of time when I didn't do anything on this, but for very long periods of time, I just wanted the truth. I mean, their supposed stories could not be verified. I just wanted to find the truth. I'd say how it felt like when I met our new family. It was a great experience. I think I was just kind of going with it. In a sense, you're so busy doing this that and I totally appreciated it at the time. Um, I had been so focused on like just solving the mystery. I hadn't really stopped to think of like, what would it actually be like to meet these flesh and blood people. And it was an incredibly positive experience meeting them. So yeah, I think I, without giving anything away, I can say, I think I mentioned, one very rewarding part of this experience was, giving my dad the answers that he had always wanted and sharing with him the meeting of his extended family. But I think the second part of it is I've made some wonderful friends, some people who like I'm not actually related to, but just people who I met through all of these new connections. So yeah, I think at the time, Tracy, I was just kind of winging it.
Were there any unexpected name changes, like, not Hanson, where you thought it would be?
Oh, Chris, you must have been at the head of your class. I think I'm just going to not get into those details right now. But I do tell all in the book, Chris, so I hope you will read it.
We have a question in the audience again, so I'm gonna send you over to her.
Hi, Anne. My name is Robin, and I'm very disappointed to not hear a little bit more from you tonight about your findings. But I do have a question about not how you felt when you met your relatives, but when you learned what you had wanted to learn about your grandparents, you know, what it was that they were hiding. Did you feel shocked? Were you sad? Tell us about your emotion that way.
Yeah, I was shocked. Um, yeah, I was shocked. Um, I wouldn't say that I was sad. I would have to sort of backtrack here. I I have no memory of my grandmother, but I was quite close to my grandpa Frank, as in Frank and Ida, and he was a lovely, kind, gentle man, and so I was shocked, but I guess I wasn't angry, I wasn't sad. I know my dad was also quite shocked. And again, as often is the case for men, especially of his generation, he just kind of hid his feelings from me. And it took him a long time to admit that it was painful for him to learn the truth. And again, this goes back to him always, wanting to protect me and my sisters. He didn't want to place a burden on me. But, and I would say, I mean, I certainly was shocked, but, it was not my place to judge. And I also think that there's, my grandparents kept a secret for a very long time. Um, and I do think that, secrets, can, if you keep secrets too long, I think they can be a burden for people. So, my grandparents were both gone by the time that I discovered the truth. But, I make no judgments. I was shocked. I wouldn't say I was sad. I had wanted to know the truth and I learned it.
Another question from our chat group here.
Mm-hmm.
Adrian would like to know how you or why you started the research and how you knew there was a secret to investigate. And Leslie, and if we have more questions here, of course we can ask those. People would like to know where the book is available and where they
Right.
can buy it.
Yes. Well, I mean, the whole thing started because, as far back as I can remember, my dad was always wondering about his parents' past. My aunt Virginia, who married into the family, she had collected these names from my grandparents. She had researched them. She couldn't validate anything. Then, when I was in college, my dad asked me to do the research, and I started, and I simply couldn't validate or verify anything in these family trees that my grandparents had given. But my father always kept encouraging me to do the research. And, I love my dad. I'll do it. And it's just, my aunt, my uncle, my sisters, and we could not validate anything. And I guess I'm just kind of an inquisitive person. Like, this just made no sense. I think I said somewhere in the book, whole families do not live and die in major cities in North America in the 20th century without some record of someone appearing someplace. So, so it just, the more that I could not find any answers, the more I wanted to know. And of course, my dad kept on encouraging me. He always wanted me to find out. Although interestingly, he didn't want to do the research himself. And I asked him why, and he said, oh, I don't really have the skills to do that. And it was like, that is kind of silly, because my dad, you know, he was a researcher at a drug company. So but yeah, I think ultimately, you know, the fact the more I could not find the answer, the more I wanted to find it. Does that make sense?
Yes. Class, last question from the chat, and then if you don't mind just telling people where they can buy it. But the question from the chat says,
Yeah.
you're fine. Did you try ancestry.com or the Mormons?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I guess through the 90s, you know, we had to do the old-fashioned analog version of research. But when genealogy websites, namely Ancestry, became available in the late 1990s, I certainly used them. And I guess that's sort of a proxy when I say when I was talking about how I looked at census records, city directories, and so forth. Beginning in the late 1990s, I accessed them through Ancestry. And interestingly, Ancestry, they changed their data sources sometime in the early 2000s. And their data became much better, like in the around in the 2004-05 time frame. But yes, I certainly used Ancestry and any other genealogy site that that was available.
And lastly, where can we buy the book?
Oh yes. Oh, where can you buy the book? Yes, silly me. And I actually have a slide for this. So let's just go back to the slideshow. So on to the next. Yes. So so let's see. The book is available. You can order the paperback or Kindle version from Amazon. You can also order it online from Barnes and Noble. Or if you want, you can order the book from your local independent bookstore. So any other questions?
One last question for you in the audience. Hang on just a second.
This is Julianne. Did you happen to work with Catherine Powers at the Boston Globe? She was from Minnesota. She was a book.
Oh, I have not worked with her. I'm actually in the process of putting together a pitch for the Boston Globe. Oh, by the way, I'd have to say I was totally thrilled. I don't know if any of you saw, but I had a nice write-up in the Pioneer Press this past Sunday on the book. But at any rate, no, Catherine Powers, the name sounds familiar, but I have not worked with her. So is she still at the Globe? I don't recall seeing that name recently.
She is not.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Anne. We really, really appreciate you. And is there any place that people can contact you if they have more questions?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Let's see. You can, my website is annehanson.com. Actually, let me just go back to sharing again. And I do have contact information. Yeah, so my email address is anne@annehanson.com, very easy. And of course, I always say it's an E in Anne and Hanson, O-N. So yeah, you can email me, or if you can also send a message via my website, and I'll get it either way. Yeah, the only other thing I would say in closing is one of the things, I mean, I think I mentioned how going through this experience with my dad was wonderful and rewarding. And I think people who are part of history societies probably are the type to do this anyway, but I just think it's so important to do family history interviews with family members. Like I know my cousin Tracy, with your dad, you did a recorded interview with him. And I mean, and I am just so grateful that I did this with my dad. I just came to know him in an entirely different way. And even things that weren't really related to the book and research per se, I just came to know him so much better and understand him so much better. So I am very grateful for that.
Well, thank you so very much. And thank you all so much for attending on Zoom, and those of you in person as well. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, everyone. I enjoyed it.